photo icon resplendent upon the front of it. It was when Anthony Julius was appointed as UCL's first Professor of Law and the Arts in 2017 that he summoned me to a meeting, and one doesn't refuse Anthony's summonses, to talk about whether he could mark the inauguration of his post with something Benthamic. And so we talked it over, and we decided that a re-evaluation of Bentham and the fine arts would be quite an appropriate thing to do. And I thought, I know just the man to join us, and that was Malcolm Quinn at University of the Arts, who is both a Bentham scholar and also well, his background is also in sort of philosophy of the arts. And so we got together and decided who we would like to come and speak at a series of seminars. And so we gathered together the speakers whose contributions eventually appeared in the volume. The exception was Jan-Melissa Schramm, who spoke at a conference we held shortly after the seminar series, but her paper was so in line with what we'd done in the seminar series that John kindly accepted our invitation to join the project. And so all the papers which were given in that seminar series are now published in the Bentham and the Arts volume. We asked all the contributors to read and to focus on a volume we recently published in the collected works containing Bentham's writings on sexual morality. So this is the volume of sexual irregularities. And so that formed a focus for the volume, as did John Stuart Mill's criticism of Bentham, saying, in particular, Bentham's views on taste. And you know, Mill's criticism was basically that Bentham only reduced everything to morality and ignored aspects such as aesthetics and beauty. So anyway, we thought it was time for a reassessment, and you'll hear today from several of the speakers: Stella Sandford, Emmanuelle de Champs, Jan-Melissa Schramm, Tim Milnes, Malcolm Quinn, and Carolyn Shapiro, who will talk about their contributions. But first, we're going to hear from Anthony Julius. He gets extra time because it was his inspiration that led to the production of the volume. And so just one further point about sort of the housekeeping. If you'll keep your microphones and cameras turned off, unless you are speaking, of course. And at the end, we'll have a question session when we've heard from all our speakers. And if you'd like to ask a question, then you can use, as Tim just explained, you can use the hand sign on the bar, which appears when you hover your cursor over the screen, or else ask a question in the meeting chat. Again, you can bring that up by using the speech bubble symbol on the bar. So anyway, let me now hand over to Anthony, who wrote on liberty I should know because I've read it so many times on John Stuart Mill and Bentham's attitude towards literary censorship. So Anthony, over to you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Philip. I think you kind of slightly overestimated my role in all of this, because my recollection of our conversation was that you were there pretty much before me while we were talking about what I might be able to do in the faculty on Bentham. But anyway, it was a really enjoyable collaboration, and I hope that we'll be able to work together on other related projects. The reason that it was interesting to me to talk about Bentham in relation to Milnes, partly because of my own experience of at Cambridge when I was undergraduate reading English, and so an event very much in my past, and in part because of a project that actually I'm engaged in at the moment, which will not be fully realized until at some point in the future, I hope not too distant future, which is the writing of a book, completing writing a book and publishing of a book on censorship of the arts. So this event and the launch of the Bentham book, in a sense, for me, my own experience of it is that it's suspended between these two kind of ideal events, that my undergraduate years at Cambridge and the publication of this book on art censorship, which I've called Shameless Authors. It's a reference to a letter that Freud writes to his one-time collaborator Fliess in the end of the 1890s. Freud says to Fliess, help me in the analysis of and writing up of my own dreams. I don't trust myself not to. I don't trust myself to judge what is possible to publish, to go public with, when it comes to revealing these most intimate thoughts of mine. I no longer have the shame, he says, required of an author. So what it is to be a shameless author, what it is to not have what is, in the received sense, that shame required of authors is kind of the subject of my investigation. But in any event, where do Mill and Bentham figure in this, and why is this piece that I've written for the volume that Philip and Malcolm and I co-edited? It figures for me as part of this larger project, which is in part to write a history of the censorship of the arts in emerging liberal democracies. And I've chosen the non-arbitrary date of 1857 for reasons which I'll give in a moment or two. And partly it's the history of 1857 through to present times. And for me, there is a kind of a moment of rupture, almost, actually a conjunctural shift within that period across the years 1988 to 1990. And again, I'll explain why. Partly historical and partly, one might say, normative, in the sense that I want to develop what I regard as better arguments within the liberal philosophical or political philosophical tradition in defense of art, free speech, of the kind of discourses that artists and writers, creative writers, work in: poems, plays, novels, easel paintings, art installations, sculptures, and so on. Because my sense is, and it's a sense I've had since '89, actually, when I mean, those of us who are of that age will remember the Rushdie fatwa. And I think this is a shared view, that the sense that liberals, in the kind of broad sense of the term, I mean the non-American sense of the term, that's to say broader, and also in the narrower sense, that's to say people working within intellectually, vocationally working within liberal intellectual traditions, particularly the traditions of political philosophy, philosophy of government, moral philosophy, and all the rest of it, were unable adequately to formulate positions in defense of Rushdie. And that, at any rate, was my view. And some sense in which that failure was not just a failure, so to speak, of that generation, of my generation, alone. Though it was a failure which had somewhat deeper generational roots than that. And how that might be interrogated, how one might understand that failure in some broader historical sense, and in order to address it and find some way of improving the liberal case for free speech in relation to the arts. This is the other aspect of my project. And there is a kind of element of construction and an element of critique. The element of construction is to find elements within the liberal tradition that actually can be deployed in better defense of the arts. And the element of critique is to identify those obstacles to that work of construction. And this is where Bentham and Mill fit in, because they sit squarely as, I mean, more than merely representative instances of both construction and critique. Bentham very much, I understand, as making a contribution towards the better construction of liberal defences of art-free speech. I mean, somewhat perhaps counterintuitively, certainly somewhat counterintuitively for those of us who were educated in the kind of Cambridge English tradition, which is most clearly associated with, but not limited to, Leavis, F.R. Leavis, and specifically to his kind of railing against technologico-Benthamite civilization, and the introduction to his edition of the Mill essays on Bentham and Coleridge kind of set that out, to the point at which nobody, certainly no undergraduates in the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s and 70s, exposed to that kind of reasoning, would ever want to waste any time reading Bentham. So while Bentham sits counterintuitively in the construction category, that's to say, because I regard him as a liberal, that's to say, as someone who properly understood, differently understood, can contribute to a better liberal defense of free speech. Mill, again, counterintuitively, sits as an obstacle, and for reasons that I set out in my piece, which hence the title of the piece, More Bentham, Less Mill. I said I would go back quickly to why 1857 and 1988 to 1990. My interest in the history and the historical bit of this kind of combined historical and kind of prescriptive book that I'm writing. It starts in 1857 because it's in 1857 in the sense that it's the earliest point at which one can say some kind of system, some kind of part global system of liberal democracy begins to emerge. but begins to emerge in multiple moments of crisis. And it's also in that year that that there are events, that major events, inaugurating events of literary censorship that take place, or of events that introduce a literary censorship regime. So in Britain, for example, in Britain, the Obscene Publications Act, the first act, is passed, and the one that then governs the reception of and the treatment of obscenity, as it was understood, literary obscenity, for substantially over 100 years before its successor act. In France, Flaubert is prosecuted for Madame Bovary, which is the first major novel in both the realist and modernist movements. And Baudelaire is prosecuted, the poet Baudelaire is prosecuted for Flowers of Evil. Extraordinary, actually, these two major works. The Baudelaire collection, again, inaugurating a kind of modernist project in the writing of poetry, as well as being a revisiting of Romanticism, so that the combination of Flaubert and Baudelaire introduces that nexus of relations between realism, Romanticism, and modernism, which then define literary production until the 1970s, perhaps even the 1980s. Melville publishes his last novel, The Confidence Man, which gets an absolutely dismal reception, confirming his intuition. He wrote a letter to Hawthorne in 1851, saying, what I feel most moved to write is that's banned, he says, because it will not pay. So the Confidence Man, and the kind of dismal reception that it receives, that it's given, is for Melville confirmation of a kind of non-state version of censorship. I mean, he expressly used the word banned. We might call it a market reception or capitalist reception of censorship, and that then has its kind of global elaboration in the financial panic of 1857, which is the first global financial convulsion, which teaches its own lesson to creative writers of their dependence on the market, the collapse of publishing houses, and so on. I mean, 1857 is extraordinary. One could write several volumes on that. It's an extraordinary year for women writers. Elizabeth Gaskell publishes her biography of Bronte, of Charlotte Bronte. George Eliot publishes Scenes of Clerical Life, which is her first kind of fictional work. Elizabeth Barrett Browning writes Aurora Leigh. Emily Dickinson kind of goes into the kind of year-long retreat before her extraordinary years of literary productivity, 1858 onwards. Julia Ward Howe, the American writer, has the most kind of productive year of her life, and so on and so forth. And if one studies these women writers, what becomes clear is that censorship is kind of an inadequate way of thinking about the constraints on writing. One should better think in terms of domination, so that censorship becomes, so to speak, in that year, a moment of triumph for women writers as they kind of emerge into some form of speech, literary speech, which is specific and unusual. And I could go on, I won't. 1989, 1988, 1990, obviously not just the fatwa, but the collapse of communism and the collapse of a whole kind of alternative regime of censorship against which liberal democracies define themselves. The murder in India of Safdar Hashmi, the playwright, by kind of communalist elements. invention of the hypertext, the World Wide Web, the introduction of internet, and the whole question of censorship of the internet is raised in '89, and then you have a kind of vampire version of communism emerging in the Tiananmen Square protests, which lead to a reformulation of the Chinese Communist project, and in the matter of censorship, of course, China and the way in which China operates in the world now is a major challenge, not just to censorship in political terms, but also in literary, cultural, creative terms. So 57 and 89 are for me the pivot years in my history, while in the normative bits of the book, Mill and Bentham are the critical figures, not alone, in identifying what is living and what it constitutes an obstacle in the tradition, in the project of formulating proper liberal defenses of art, free speech. And if one follows through, looking at kind of successive generations of liberal thinkers, one finds a kind of a discomfort with art and literature, but at the same time, the elements that assist. Just very quickly, you find, I mean, T.H. Green, the kind of major liberal intellectual after Mill, friend of Swinburne until Swinburne publishes his kind of scandalous volume in 1866, and he breaks with Swinburne on this. You find Hobhouse, L.T. Hobhouse, writing his book on liberalism in the very moment when theatre censorship and the censorship of cinemas is being discussed, and yet he says nothing about either. And you find in Isaiah Berlin, I mean, in the sense that for my purposes, one of the most interesting liberals, on the one hand, an extraordinarily open attitude towards literature, I mean, unique really among major intellectual thinkers. But on the other hand, you find him identifying in Romanticism, that's to say in literature, the very kind of origins of a reaction and fascism. So there it is. I really want to thank Philip for giving me the opportunity to develop some of these arguments in this volume. The kind of milieu, the intellectual milieu at UCL has been wonderfully nurturing, and I hope that this volume is but the first in a series of explorations of the contribution that Bentham studies can make to the study of the arts, and it's one that I'm very proud to participate in. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Just a quick housekeeping. If you've got your camera on, please turn it off, and please go on to mute as well. That's if you hover over your screen and click on your camera icon, then that will turn the camera off. Thank you. Just saves on the bandwidth. So Anthony's chapter, which is superb. I mean, I like it because it's a defence of Bentham against Mill. Not that we're anti-Mill, because Mill was a good chap. was a good utilitarian like Bentham, and of course one of the main well, he's on liberty, of course, is a defining text of liberalism, but to see read about the way in which Anthony is concerned about Mill's let's say, equivocation of the defence of literature. The volume, moving on, the book, the first chapter is by me, and it's called The Epicurean Universe of Jeremy Bentham, and I sort of try to set the scene for Bentham's thinking on, as I say, the subtitle Taste, Beauty and Reality. The second chapter is a chapter by Francis Ferguson comparing Kant and Bentham. The title of that is not Kant but Bentham on taste, so an echo of Bentham's work, not Paul but Jesus. And Francis is based, for those of you who don't know, is based at the University of Chicago, so I guess it's sort of 4:30 in the morning there, which is probably a good reason why Francis isn't speaking this morning. But the third chapter is by Stella Sandford, who's professor at Kingston University and works on sex and gender in the history of philosophy. And again, this is another marvellous chapter, and I remember the super lecture that Stella gave us. And so, Stella, would you like to take over now and talk to us about your chapter, which was entitled "Envy Accompanied with Antipathy: Bentham on the Psychology of Sexual Ressentiment"? Hello, Stella.
Hello there. Am I visible and unmuted?
You are.
Yes.
You're
okay.
Coming through loud and clear, and
Great.
We can see you clearly as well.
Great. Well, I would like to begin by saying thanks to Philip and Malcolm especially for suggesting that I contribute something to the volume on Bentham's writings on sexuality, because I found it to be such an incredibly rewarding and interesting task. I will confess that when I first read these writings, I was frankly astonished. I could hardly believe what I was writing. I was simply amazed at how modern and indeed contemporary Bentham's views seemed. And I was asked in particular to consider these writings in relation to Freud's work on sexuality. So as I began, I could see that there were the points of relation between Bentham and Freud were quite obvious, but I was again amazed to find that in many respects Bentham is much the more radical thinker. So I'll just speak very briefly. I'll just say something about the argument in my chapter, and then I want to add at the end another point that I didn't make in the chapter. So briefly, Bentham, as I'm sure most people know, he understands sexuality as a sixth sense. And because sexual taste is as subjective as the tastes of the other senses, and just refers only to one's propensity to take pleasure in the objects of the senses, for Bentham it makes no sense to decry another's sexual tastes any more than it makes any sense to decry their culinary tastes. In a way, I suppose he's saying pleasure just is what it is. He goes through and demolishes the arguments, such as they are, because they're not very good, against homosexuality, and effectively concludes that as there is no reasoned case against it, we need to ask a different question, which is, how can we explain then the ferocity with which homosexuality is condemned? And his answer is couched in the same terms as the treatment of almost all other issues in his work. The problem is that he identifies conclusions are reached not according to the principle of utility, but according to those principles that are adverse to it. That is the principle of antipathy and the principle of asceticism. Now, the problem with a principle, a position based on the principle of antipathy is quite easy to expose, because my antipathy towards something, well, we may be able to see that my antipathy towards something is behind my condemnation of it, but it's not any kind of warrant for moral disapprobation, or in the case of homosexuality, legislation against that practice. So although it's acknowledged I may personally feel displeasure at the thought of another person's sexual choice, that's not in itself an argument against that choice or against the pleasure attached to another person's choice. So that I am motivated by my displeasure to condemn is understandable, but my displeasure can't legislate. Bentham also says, though, that the principle of asceticism is behind the condemnation of homosexuality, and that's a little bit more difficult to understand, I think. Indeed, asceticism itself is a little bit more difficult to understand within the context of Bentham's utilitarianism, because if the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain are the primary motivations or springs of all action, it's difficult to understand how I can be motivated to act against my own pleasure. And in my contribution to the volume, I've tried to show that Bentham explains with the idea of substitutive motivations and substituted satisfaction of pleasures, how the principle of asceticism works. Bentham thinks of asceticism in terms of sacrifice and says Mosaic religion requires of us a sacrifice of pleasures, and having sacrificed our pleasures, we are envious of the pleasures of others. And Bentham's sophisticated psychological argument is that the condemnation of homosexuality, which it's important to remember extends not just to disapprobation, but to physical, brutal physical punishment and even execution, that this condemnation of homosexuality is itself a substituted pleasure, the pleasure in the untrammeled gratification of ill will. And uniquely, he suggests, in this case, society gives free rein to what it would otherwise condemn. That is, it gives free rein to the unrestricted gratification of ill will through the sanctioned expression of anger, hatred, vengeance, spite, maliciousness, cruelty, all of those affections associated with antipathy. But at the same time, of course, it's covered with a show of piety, and the one who condemns is able to convince themselves that in condemning they bring themselves a little closer to God. So in my contribution, I tried to show that Bentham provides a very sophisticated psychological analysis of the condemnation of homosexuality, and that this analysis includes what in a later parlance we might describe with reference to Freud's concepts of the unconscious, of sublimation, of displacement, and so on. So that's all in the chapter. I'd like to add one more point today. We now have a word for what it is that Bentham is describing. We call it homophobia. This word was introduced in the mid-1960s, later than I had imagined it was, but introduced in the mid-1960s by the psychoanalytic psychologist George Weinberg. And it was popularized by Weinberg's book published in 1972, which is called Society and the Healthy Homosexuality. Now, more recently, writing about what was achieved with the introduction of this term, Gregory Herrick says that Weinberg challenged entrenched thinking about the problem of homosexuality by standing a central assumption of heterosexual society on its head. That is, Weinberg, the achievement of Weinberg's introduction of this term homophobia, he says, is that he located the problem of homosexuality not in homosexual people, but in the heterosexual people who are intolerant of them. And Herrick says that in giving a name to this hostility, Weinberg identified it, homophobia, as itself a problem worthy of scholarly analysis and worthy of intervention. Now, I don't dispute what Herrick says, but I just wanted to add that it's so striking that this is precisely what Bentham had achieved so much earlier in his writings on sexuality, this flipping of the problem. And what is more, Weinberg and the others who first used the term homophobia tended to, first of all, at least, think of the problem in terms of the homophobe's fear. I mean, that hence the word homophobia. And the earliest discussions of homophobia talked, for example, about the straight man's fear that he might be thought not masculine enough. And Weinberg himself talked of the dread that the homophobe felt in being in close proximity with the homosexual and the self-loathing inculcated in the homosexuality. Weinberg and others at the time developed their analysis, as that indicates, in the context of a growing criticism of the enforcement of traditional masculine gender norms. Now, that gender analysis is absent from Bentham's discussion, but his analysis is in some ways more psychoanalytically acute, because it hints at the idea that what lies behind the ferocious condemnation of homosexuality is the repudiation of homosexual desire. What the homophobe fears is their own desire for others of the same sex. And I think that would be how Freud, for example, would have thought of homophobia. So I'll end by saying that there's not much point engaging in counterfactual historical speculation, but it is very hard not to regret that Bentham's writings on sexuality, in which he was certainly a shameless author, to use Anthony's phrase, were not published and given a reasoned reception a whole lot earlier than they were. Thank you.
Thanks, Stella. That was superb, and I think from Bentham Studies' point of view, what's really important, what Stella has done, is countered the criticism that we often hear about Bentham, was that he was psychologically naive, and really interesting as well what you said at the end. Maybe there will be some questions on that, but what one comment I remember being struck by a remark which is in the Bentham manuscript somewhere, which he made, was that the aristocrat regards the poor person as disgusting because they smell, and he says, well, the problem isn't the smelly person, it's the aristocrat's nose, which is what I say to my daughter when she complains about the smell of the cheese in the fridge. But there we are, and it's a terrific chapter that Stella's written, and I do commend it to everyone. And but they're all terrific, and we're going to move on to another one now, and it's Emmanuelle de Champs, who's she won't mind me saying, she's an old friend of the Bentham Project. She's based in France at the University of Cergy Paris. She's a professor of British history and civilization. I'm always amused by the idea that the French think the British have any civilization, but it's anyway. Emmanuelle's chapter is entitled "Literature, Morals and Utility: Bentham, Dumont and De Style," and it's in the second part of our book, which deals with intellectual history and literature. So Emmanuelle, over to you.
Yeah, hello. I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you fine, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Philip and Malcolm, for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the volume and to work on the topic of Bentham and the arts, which I hadn't explored previously. I found the theme especially challenging, and also which allowed me to reconsider some views I had about Bentham, which is always a pleasure when you've worked on a topic for quite a long time. I also appreciated the fact that both the seminar series and the book invited people who do not work primarily on Bentham to contribute and to read Bentham's text, and I think it does so much to our understanding that it's really to be commended. On reading the final volume, I really learned a lot, and I think for me, as we've said already, the first striking point is the strong connection between the arts and sex, which is not, is something which is very specific to Bentham's understanding. And both, of course, the arts and sex are linked through the concept of taste, which links what is physiological, what is psychological, and what is socially constructed. So this is something which is, it's the first point I wanted to highlight in my reading of the volume. The other significant insight, which appears in many chapters, is how central Bentham's view on language is to his aesthetics and to his utilitarianism in general. I want to conclude those final remarks, or final introductory remarks, by saying that on reading Philip's introduction, pointing out the double meaning of pushpin. I felt sorry that French speakers hadn't spotted it earlier, which they should have done, really. On the other hand, Dumont himself, the first who read the manuscripts and translated them into French, used the word jeu d'épingle, and I couldn't find any double entendre or double meaning for this specific phrase. Right, so now to come to my chapter itself. The way I approached it was in the continuity of my book, Enlightenment and Utility, in which I made the case for reading Bentham in the context of French Enlightenment thought and what happened and its changes at the time of the French Revolution and in the aftermath. So the topic of Bentham and the arts allowed me to test this method on a topic which I hadn't explored for my book. So in following this method, I first looked at the views of French utilitarians, 18th century utilitarians, such as Helvetius on D'Holbach, on taste, the arts, and which is something, and sex, but I didn't develop the sex view in the chapter itself. Helvetius, we know, is regularly cited by Bentham as one of his sources, but D'Holbach, or Holbach, maybe has his name in English, isn't. So the first finding was that Bentham's discussion of the arts and of reward relied significantly on examples, if not on ideas, directly borrowed from D'Holbach. And especially in reading D'Holbach, you do come across some examples which are used by Bentham, which is, I think, here a clear sign that Bentham was engaged in a dialogue with D'Holbach when he was writing on taste and the arts and on reward. Right. So why is the issue of taste especially important for the utilitarian tradition as a whole, so broader than just Bentham and Mill? It's because, of course, utilitarians consider pain and pleasures as the main motives for human actions, but they're also tools in the hands of legislators. So understanding what causes pleasure is a moral and a political issue. So it's especially important to look at what 18th century utilitarians thought about taste and pleasure in the context of Enlightenment aesthetic thought. Right. Like most of their contemporaries, Helvetius, Holbach, and Bentham understand aesthetic norms as precisely at the juncture of the social and of the individual. There's something very specific to Bentham's own approach compared to Helvetius and Holbach. He appears, as we've pointed out, as is pointed out also by other contributors to the volume, Bentham is fiercely individualistic in his conception of pleasure in the field of sexuality and in the field of artistic appreciation. So that's the first. Comparing Bentham to his contemporaries allowed as well to trace the similarities, but also to better understand what is specific of Bentham's view. He also stands out, and that was especially striking, in the political implications which he drew from this fiercely individualistic way of considering taste. So for him, as we've said already, imposing one common standard of taste is always a mark of aristocratic domination, and this is something which Philip just pointed out. So in this respect, when you try to draw political implications from his views on taste, his ideas seem almost anarchical. In fact, when you think of Bentham's thought as a system, this individualism is combined with a very strong institutional framework, understanding precisely what happens in the case of taste has broader implications for Bentham's political thought, which need to be addressed. And so that was the point of the first part of my chapter. I then examined more specifically Bentham's considerations on the moral value of literature among the arts. In 18th again, I broadened the focus to take into account 18th century moral theory, and we have and what stands out at the time is the significant role with fiction and the arts play in defining common standards for moral judgment and moral behavior. So there is something very specific about the moral value of literature, which doesn't only have to do with fiction and imagining moral situations, but also has to do with the choice of words and the question of style. So Bentham's view on style, which are again linked to his very specific understanding of language, is something which, well, forms a nexus which can be fruitfully studied. Again, the conclusion is the same as in the first part. Bentham stands out for refusing any moral value to literary taste. Sorry, right. Though he ascribes a strong political value to the use of words and the choice of the right words in politics, but this is something which has been developed elsewhere. Right, having established the singularity of Bentham's aesthetics, I then turned in the last part to the early reception of his ideas. And I first look at what Etienne Dumont, the Genevan translator and a friend of Bentham, what he made of the manuscripts on taste and pleasure, which he used as part of the Théorie des peines et des récompenses, which he published in French in 1811. So I was lucky enough to find in the archives Dumont's translator's notes and his own essays on the topic of taste and the arts and literature. Those archives are preserved in Geneva, and it's always great when you can trace the editorial history of one specific passage in such detail. So I was really lucky to find this. On the whole, Dumont appears to be extremely faithful to Bentham's ideas in his translation of this passage, which is especially striking because his own notebooks reveal the extent of his disagreement on the topic itself. So Dumont was in fact personally deeply opposed to Bentham's aesthetics, and in trying to understand that, it was easy to make the connection with Rousseau. And Rousseau is, of course, the major Genevan and Enlightenment intellectual, his fame extending far beyond Geneva itself. But on Dumont, who was born in the second half of the 18th century in Geneva, of course, Rousseau is the defining figure to understand his politics and his aesthetics. So an interesting topic in studying Dumont was to understand how he dealt with how he connected or opposed or brought together Rousseauism and Benthamism. It's especially striking when you look at the issue of style itself and morality and aesthetics in general. So this is what I develop in the last part, and then I take this further to study the reactions of another Genevan, Germaine de Staël, who happened to be a friend of Dumont, or at least an acquaintance, someone who had extensively, of course, read Rousseau, and someone who became one of the earliest critics of Benthamite utilitarianism in her early 19th century works. So, like Dumont, she provides an interesting attempt at understanding those trends in late 18th century thought together. What is even more interesting in the case of Madame de Staël is that she's one of the first French readers of Kant. So she read Kant very early in the 19th century, and the impact that her reading of Kant had on her aesthetic views has been well studied, and it is well documented by style scholars. So when she read Kant, she immediately rejected utilitarianism very publicly and very loudly, especially during one of her visits to London in 1813. What is interesting is that in the way she construed her attack on Benthamite utilitarianism, she used images and tropes which turn up again immediately in British 19th century criticism and define Bentham's posterity in the Romantic period. She's the first to characterize Bentham as a Philistine, and of course the word is not from her, but this idea that utilitarianism is has nothing to do with the arts, and which is the idea with which Anthony Julius singled out as the defining opinion on Bentham way into the 20th century, can be traced very clearly to her. It is to be found again in Carlyle, in Ruskin, in Matthew Arnold, and it's interesting to see how this, what had started as a very minute query on the origins of Bentham's ideas on taste, which make up, in the manuscript which I studied, only a few pages, allowed me to, turned up to have broader implications on the historical legacy of utilitarianism and on the way the debate on aesthetics was structured after the Romantic period. Right, thank you.
Thanks very much, Emmanuelle, and thank you for your terrific chapter. In a sense, the Dumont connection continues with our next chapter, our next presenter, which is Jan-Melissa Schramm from the University of Cambridge. Jan's interests lie in law and literature, and the title of her chapter was Jeremy Bentham's Imagination and the Ethics of Prose Style, Paraphrase, Substitution, Translation. Hello, Jan, and you talk about Dumont as well in your essay, but over to you.
Thanks very much, Philip, and thank you to both yourself and to Malcolm, and indeed to Chris Riley for including me in this fantastic project. I've been delighted and very honoured to be part of it. Just on a personal note, I'd also very much like to thank Emmanuelle, who I've never met. So this is sending you greetings, Emmanuelle, from Cambridge. I'm very much indebted to your brilliant book, and our chapters have significant points of overlap with one another. I hope we get the chance to talk more about that one day. So I first read Bentham's work when I studied jurisprudence at law school about 100 years ago back in Australia. And I then practiced as a criminal lawyer for a few years, which gave me a real appreciation of Bentham's definition of the law as a set of commands backed by some pretty punitive sanctions. But since doing my PhD on the history of evidence, I've spent the last 20 years teaching 18th and 19th century literature here in Cambridge. So following on from Anthony's point, I've always been very mindful of the ways in which Bentham has been misrepresented by those with a certain aesthetic agenda. People like Charles Dickens and obviously subsequently Leavis, etc., for whom utilitarianism became the antagonist they would have to have invented if it hadn't already existed. In the culture wars of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, writers of imaginative literature seemed to need this kind of adversary against whom to sharpen their definitions of what their own disciplines could achieve. After J.S. Mill's very famous elaboration of the evident contrasts between Coleridge and Bentham, and of course those of you who know the essays will know that this is very much to poor old Bentham's detriment, Bentham was packaged up and used to represent or symbolise or stand for something, much less than he really was in the fullness of all his own writings. So part of my current project, as perhaps it's been for many of us in this volume, is to recuperate a sense of the richness of Bentham's work, a sense that's sometimes hampered by his own style and by the degrees of translation that were required for him to present his ideas to a larger audience of his own contemporaries at the time. I suppose the one idea that unites the books I've written to date is thinking about the ethics of representation and all the ways in which you can't really separate questions of style from questions of substance or content. This is true of all the big debates of the Enlightenment. We think of Blackstone versus Bentham. We think of Burke versus Paine and Godwin. We think of Bentham versus Coleridge. For each of these men, the central question is what we inherit from the past, how much of that we hold on to, and how much we jettison in our attempts to innovate or to move forward towards a fairer future. And all of these questions make themselves felt in the writer's prose style. We can think about their use of allusion, we can think about their use of biblical quotation, we can think about their invention of tropes of nationalism, nostalgia, sentimentalism, their attitude to poetic ambiguity, their preference for austerity of language, their use of precedent, their preference for codification, their reverence for the common law. These are questions of style, as Emmanuelle has said, as well as just questions of politics. There used to be an exercise for literary scholars in Cambridge, before my time, I hasten to add, where students were given undated, unattributed passages, and they had to infer authorial identity from the characteristics of the passage's prose. And it's always struck me that in the cases of Blackstone, Bentham, Burke, Godwin, Paine, all of these writers are deeply individualistic, deeply distinctive, and their political commitments very much infuse their syntactic choices. So some of the questions that I was thinking about in my own chapter then are, how do we reconcile individuality? How do we reconcile personal style with Bentham's preference for the austerity of legislative language? What then is the role of translation when the dissemination of Bentham's ideas was so dependent on Dumont's work? And what is the work of paraphrase? Why do certain phrases catch fire and ignite the political imagination in ways that others don't? I'm very interested in the ways in which different sorts of language do different sorts of political and ethical work, and I'm interested in why this might be the case. A great example of this, which might be well known to many of you, is William Twining's fabulous essay called The Ratio Decidendi of the Parable of the Prodigal Son. Can we ever reduce a parable to a maxim when part of its point is to stimulate and tease the mind into action and inquiry? Can we ever reduce any novel to the golden rule of ethics, which is do as you would be done by, even if at the very end of the novel, that's what the author tells us that the story apparently meant? Bentham, of course, is a fabulous interlocutor here because his logic of paraphrasis would suggest that the austere maxim is always preferable to the parable, the story, or the novel. But of course, hundreds of centuries of literary and theological production would dispute Bentham's conclusions here. Some sorts of truth, I think we want to argue, are not simply reducible to the lowest syntactic common instrumental denominator. Another way of thinking about this, I guess, is what causes norm innovation at a point in time when that innovation can make itself felt in the laws of a nation. And this, of course, is what the great constitutional jurist A.V. Dicey is worrying away at in his famous lectures on the relation between law and public opinion in England during the 19th century, which were published in 1905. And indeed, Henry Sumner Maine is writing about a similar question in parts of his earlier work, Ancient Law, published in 1861. For Dicey, writers and poets performed essential work in shaping the public opinion that created legislative opinion. For Henry Sumner Maine, writers and poets are even closer to Shelley's famous phrase, which many of you will know, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. For example, Henry Sumner Maine argues that the impact of the phrase liberty, equality, and fraternity was determined not by its use by lawyers, but by its rapturous reception in the literary sphere. He tells us in Ancient Law that it became, it truly exerted traction on the political imagination when it passed out of the ownership of the lawyers and into that of the literary men and the public who sat at their feet. So for Henry Sumner Maine, who counted George Eliot, Frederick Harrison, and Leslie and Fitzjames Stephen amongst his closest friends, and Charles Dickens amongst his acquaintances, the work of literary culture was to create fictional laboratories in which the mental experiments of jurisprudence might take place, disseminating exciting new developments like the belief that all men ought to be equal, and dramatising repeated acts of consent to the imposition of the rule of law. So one consequence of England's rejection of revolutionary codes of law and its preference for evolutionary change over time instead was that it afforded plenty of room for literary texts to intervene in this crucial work of norm innovation. My chapter on Bentham is part of my new book on what happened to rights language in England after the French Revolution, when horror at the bloodshed across the Channel had a chilling effect on radical thought and practice here. Many of you will know, of course, that Bentham had a famously disparaging attitude to rights talk. You'll know that he variously calls it terrorist language, a conceptual trump card deployed unfairly to beat others in argument, and of course, most famously, he calls it nonsense on stilts. This is because Bentham's definition of the law tethers it to national or domestic jurisdictions, and he thinks it fraudulent to refer to higher authorities allegedly outside the confines of the text in order to legitimise a moral or legal instruction. And this, of course, is the inherent difficulty with any branch of international or human rights law. And in recent years, historians like Samuel Moyne at Harvard and Pete DeBoller here in Cambridge have asked what sorts of conceptual continuity we can trace between the utopian language of the revolutionary Enlightenment and contemporary ideas of human rights as we might invoke them, either by citizens against their own states, which was certainly not what the architects of the revolution were thinking about in the 1790s, or in the international realm, which is well beyond the confines of the national crucible in which such language was born. Moyne's arguments will probably be familiar to all of you with an interest in the history of international law, I'm sure. But I also feel that there's a rich and complex texture to the debates of the 1790s and early 1800s in England, which he's treating very reductively. And no one more than Bentham, no one did more than Bentham, no one achieved more than Bentham in terms of thinking about the hows and whys of human equality before the law. And as he formulated it, and as Mill picked it up and transmitted it to the next generation of Victorian reformers, in a democracy, all should count for one and none for more than one. For me, the work of this volume, I think, has been to reclaim Bentham as one of the great visionaries of equality in the 19th century, not just in the field of legal philosophy, but in the sweeping onward spirit of democratization itself. The challenge for those of us who are interested in the arts is how to reconcile Bentham as the prophet of democracy with those who see paraphrasis as an intriguing process, but not an end in itself, who see it as reductive of the individual richnesses which Victorian authors wanted to hang on to. But Bentham nevertheless remains, as even J.S. Mill rather begrudgingly acknowledges perhaps, the intellectual genius who kick-started the reforms of the Victorian period. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jan. That final question really fascinating, and it's the one that our chapter moves towards investigating and posing. And I'm going. Thank you again, Jan. It's a wonderful chapter, and in fact, some of the themes overlap with Tim Milnes' chapter, Tim's in the Department of English at the University of Edinburgh, and Tim, I'm hoping you're with us somewhere.
I am, yes.
Oh, excellent! I can hear you. I can't see you yet, but
just.
Tim's chapter is entitled "Is It True? What is the Meaning of It?" which is a quote: "Bentham, Romanticism and the Fictions of Reason." Hello, Tim, and I'll hand over to you to give us your thoughts on your chapter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philip, and thanks to you and to Anthony and to Malcolm as well for inviting me to contribute to this volume, which has been a really interesting or fascinating process for me, and it really gave me the opportunity to revisit some work I was doing a wee while ago on the relationship between 19th century Romanticism and modern pragmatism, which was the subject of a book I wrote about a decade ago, sort of with the publicity-hungry title, "The Truth About Romanticism," and which that was what first brought me to Bentham. And I'd been drawn into this by, and actually an observation I'd encountered by the philosopher W.V. Quine about Bentham. And Quine had claimed that Bentham was one of the first Anglophone thinkers to deontologize the idea of truth. And what he meant by this was that Bentham, I think, helped to initiate a shift away from the idea that truth was something objectively out there and towards a theory that truth consisted in more like a coherence within a linguistic community. And what struck me about this was that it went completely against my own sort of rather vague assumptions about Bentham at that time. And it also made me realize that my thinking about the relationship between utilitarianism and romanticism was based on a bit of a crude contrast between, on one hand, the utilitarian who asserts the value of truth as hard, unsentimental fact, and on the other, the romantic writer who temporizes over the actual, sort of meditating on a world in which brute facts merge imperceptibly into imaginative interpretations. And of course, this binary was immortalized by John Stuart Mill's claim, and I'm quoting here, that by Bentham, beyond all others, men have been led to ask themselves in regard to any ancient or received opinion, is it true? And by Coleridge, what is the meaning of it? And I think the effect of Mill's assessment in those famous essays has been to polarize the utilitarian and romantic views on truth and meaning in the early 19th century, and to divide the thought of Mill's era into, on one hand, a kind of reformist, fact-based utilitarianism, and on the other, a sort of small conservative aestheticized romanticism. And what's interesting about Quine's reading of Bentham, however, and he doesn't go into Bentham extensively, but he has the kind of interesting things to say about him, was that on Quine's reading, the boundary between factual truth and meaning is more fluid than Mill's claim would suggest. On this view, facts are more elastic for Bentham than is often supposed. And so this becomes the main question of my chapter in the volume. How might this affect our view of Bentham's relation to Romanticism? And so the basis of Quine's reading of Bentham and following Quine of my own lies in the way in which Bentham sought to define certain entities, such as motive. In trying to define motive, he came to the conclusion that, in one sense at least, motives do not exist, other than as what he calls a fictitious entity, something that is a made-up, invented, but which is nonetheless a necessary part of the toolbox of our thought. In order to distinguish these necessary fictions, such as motive or disposition, from imaginative fictions, such as Centaur or Golden Mountain, Bentham calls these entities logical fictions. And the problem Bentham faced next, however, is how does one define a fictitious entity? Fictive entities or abstractions, he observes, cannot have actual examples or instances. If they could, then they wouldn't be fictitious. And so they cannot be defined by classifying them under the heading of a larger genus. A fiction, he points out, isn't like a box of apples that can be unpacked into more basic terms. Its contents are always indeterminate. So Bentham came to see that instead of being referable to basic entities or objects in the world, the meaning of logical fictions is determined by language itself. And this led him to conclude that ultimately what counts as a real entity is not whether there's a correspondence between its name and an actual existing object, but whether the use of its name makes sense within a group of competent language users. And as Quine, again, noted of Bentham, as Quine puts it, he recognized that to explain a term, we do not need to specify an object for it to refer to. So logical fictions for Bentham, like motive, bring objects into being. And the only way of defining them is to do so contextually. In other words, the only way to define such fictions is to translate obscure talk about such things into clear and transparent talk, or at least talk that is as transparent as possible. And he called this method of contextual definition paraphrasis. And this brings us back to Mill's assertion that the most fundamental question of the Benthamite is it true? And to be fair to Mill, his specific claim, to quote him correctly, is that following Bentham, men have been led to ask themselves, is it true? My suggestion here, anyway, is that whether men were led by Bentham to ask themselves this question, regardless of that, this wasn't Bentham's first question, I don't think. Because if logical fictions are an indispensable part of thought, if language is itself capable of creating truth in some way, then at least in some circumstances, the question, is it true, will depend upon the question, what does it mean? So if Bentham was more skeptical about facts than we might think, my chapter then turns to look at, well, what about the Romantics, who Mill depicts as, in a sense, setting aside truth-seeking in order to peer more deeply into the meaning of reality, or as Wordsworth puts it, into the life of things. Now, like Mill, of course, the Romantics viewed Bentham as a kind of rationalistic worshipper of facts. The Romantic essayist William Hazlitt, who was actually Bentham's tenant before being evicted for not paying his rent, accused the philosopher in his famous portrait of Bentham in The Spirit of the Age of being like an anchorite who had a mind like an inventory. And for Hazlitt, this wasn't a compliment. And of having, quote, reduced the theory and practice of human life to a caput mortuum, or a dead head of reason and dull, plodding technical calculation. So what I've said already implies that I think that Hazlitt, just like Mill in a way, misunderstands Bentham. But does Mill's assessment of the Romantic prioritization of meaning over truth apply to Hazlitt? Well, once again, I think Mill is off the mark here. Like Coleridge, Hazlitt's thought was really dominated by the figure of the sublime. And in the hands of the Romantics, famously, the sublime becomes a very useful peg onto which they can hang all their objections to the Enlightenment, to ideas of clarity, order, consensus, and above all, reason. Against these totems, the sublime embodies the obscure, disorder, the incommensurable, and above all, the power of the imagination. And yet it shouldn't be inferred from this that the Romantics rejected the idea of truth in the way that Nietzsche would later in the 19th century. If anything, it was out of an increased awe for truth that Romantic writers like Hazlitt invoked the figure of the sublime. Like the ancient iconoclasts, the belief in the absolute existence of truth went hand in hand with the belief that absolute truth is unknowable. To represent truth from this perspective is to misrepresent it. So once again, I think Mill sort of misrepresents the case here with the Romantics. Just as the most fundamental question for Bentham is not, is it true, but what does it mean? So for the romantic acolyte of, for a romantic acolyte of Coleridge, such as Hazlitt, the meaning of life is determined by a deep truth that cannot be fathomed by human consciousness. Romantic writers like Coleridge and Hazlitt don't abandon truth, they sublimate it. Where Bentham progressively strives for greater clarity and meaning in order to advance human knowledge, the Romantics cultivate obscure truth in order to revive what they see as the nation's flagging imaginative power. What really separates Bentham and the Romantics then, I think, and I'll just finish up here, is not Mill's binary choice of truth and meaning, but two different responses to the indeterminacy of truth. On one hand, what I think is the kind of pragmatic lucidity of Bentham, and on the other, the kind of concern with the sublime enchantment of the Romantics. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank again for your really fascinating chapter, which really helps to, if you like, undermine the image we've all been sort of brought up with on the contrast between the utilitarians and the Romantics. And the final chapter in that particular section is Anthony's, which we've heard about, and the third part of the book deals with aesthetics, taste and art, and the 8th chapter is by Malcolm Quinn. Hello, Malcolm.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. Professor of Cultural and Political History at the University of Arts in London. And Malcolm's chapter is entitled Enlightenment Unrefined, Bentham's Realism and the Analysis of Beauty. So Malcolm, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank my fellow editors and all the contributors to the book. I do think this is a very important work because it builds on the achievement of the Bentham Project UCL in delivering an authoritative edition of Bentham's writing on sexuality, a major achievement, which has enabled us to look further at the connections that Bentham makes between sexuality and taste, as we have learned. In turn, as I shall argue, and this is the main point of my little talk, this places Bentham's reputation as a Philistine in an entirely new light. In this short talk, I'm going to speak for a couple of minutes about these connections between sexuality and taste, which Stella so brilliantly discussed earlier, and then say what I think this tells us about Bentham's reputation for cultural barbarism and philistinism. So I think the connections that Bentham makes between sexuality and taste can be summarized as follows. 1, sexuality is a matter of taste, that is, an inclination or disposition towards pleasure. In Of Sexual Irregularities, Bentham says, quote him, taste for any object is an aptitude or disposition to derive pleasure from that object, unquote. In a note added to this sentence in the manuscripts, Bentham said, quote, here give illustrations from other objects of taste, ex gratia subjects of the fine arts, unquote. Elsewhere in the text, Bentham refers to homosexuality as, quote, the Attic taste. So, in summary, sexuality is a matter of taste. Second, cultural taste is determined by sexuality. Also in Sexual Irregularities, Bentham says, quote, till of late years, the number of senses had by usage been fixed at 5. Of late years, a sense corresponding to and put in exercise by the act of sexuality has been added to the number, unquote. Bentham's assertion that there is a sense corresponding to and put in exercise by the act of sexuality, again, which Stella mentioned, implies that the gratification of sexual desire relies for its fulfillment on a specific type of observation that receives and responds to information about possible sources of sexual pleasure. The sociologist Niklas Luhmann has reminded us that we have forgotten the importance of sexuality as a form of social observation, through which the body, quote Luhmann, makes its own distinctions and decides whether or not to be sexually attracted. Observing this observer, says Luhmann, leads us to ask whether or not it dutifully follows cultural imperatives, or whether there is an unavoidable akrasia, lack of self-control, in humans and social systems, unquote. So the argument that Luhmann makes here about sexual desire as an unruly observer of cultural imperatives was anticipated by Bentham's inclusion of both subjects of the fine arts and sexual acts under the general heading of taste as disposition and inclination. The other important thing to note, of course, is that if the fine arts and sexual acts both come under this general heading of taste as disposition and inclination, sexuality is a matter of pleasure, not a matter of biological reproduction and the norms of family life. So that's part one. How does this place Bentham's philistinism in a new light, or his reputed philistinism? In this regard, my chapter deals firstly with attacks on Bentham's hedonic utilitarianism as cultural barbarism by Thomas Macaulay, Matthew Arnold, Karl Marx, and Roger Scruton. And second, and this is perhaps what's overlooked, Bentham's own definition of cultural barbarism in The Rationale of Reward. Just to backtrack for a second, Karl Marx's claim famously was, quote Marx, the arch-Philistine Jeremy Bentham was the heavy-footed oracle of the common sense of the 19th century bourgeoisie, unquote. So that's pretty condemnatory. But I'm now going to turn to Bentham's own definition of cultural barbarism. The Rationale of Reward is often cited by those who accuse Bentham of cultural barbarism because it contains the sentence, quote, prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry, unquote. However, the Rationale of Reward contains its own attack on cultural barbarism because Bentham criticizes Helvetius's description of utilitarian legislation, in which beauty is offered as a reward for service to the state. Quote Bentham on Helvetius, among certain barbarous or half-civilized nations, the services of their warriors have been rewarded with the favors of women. Helvetius appears to smile with approbation at this mode of exciting bravery. How could they, that is Helvetius and Montesquieu, have forgotten that favors not preceded by an uncontrolled choice afforded the spectacle rather of the degradation of woman than the rewarding of a hero? So Bentham's criticism of Helvetius in The Rationale of Reward is consistent with his comments on pushpin and poetry, as well as his criticism of the promotion of refined taste by Joseph Addison and David Hume in the same volume. So for Bentham, cultural barbarism is located in socially normative definitions of beauty, centrally managed by Helvetius's utilitarian legislator and self-managed in the choices of Addison's refined spectator. For Bentham, the central management of social standards of beauty described by Helvetius would be barbaric because it assumes there can be state control over the allocation and social distribution of individual pleasure. And while Bentham says that the state can control pain, it can't control pleasure. The self-management of standards of beauty advocated by Joseph Addison was also barbaric because the critic of taste crushed a variety of propensities and inclinations towards pleasure, in Bentham's words, under the strokes of his club. Bentham's linking of sexuality to taste and of taste to disposition and inclination introduces a different kind of observer than the Addisonian person of taste, who uses objects of art to refine his own perception and who separates the self-controlled pleasures of refined taste from the undisciplined pleasures of public entertainment. Bentham's challenges to aesthetics in The Rationale of Reward, when read alongside his writings on sexuality and taste, also offer a particular way to look at art history. Bentham's attack on Addison in The Rationale of Reward, when set alongside his praise for William Hogarth's prints, Beer Street and Gin Lane of 1751. I'm sure everyone knows this, but it's two prints, one showing the evils of the consumption of gin and one showing the benefits of beer. So Bentham praised this. So his praise for that opens up the possibility for a distinction between the Addisonian Hogarth that is presented in the Artist Treatise on the Analysis of Beauty of 1753 and the Benthamite Hogarth of Beer Street and Gin Lane. In Beer Street and Gin Lane, Hogarth anticipates Bentham's position on aesthetics by doubling down on realism, presenting a practical ethics that takes account of taste as inclination and predilection for gin, rather than self-management. Bentham's judgment on Beer Street and Gin Lane was, quote Bentham, that admirable artist, i.e. Hogarth, was one of the best of moralists, and it's not often you see an artist described as a good moralist. This praise from Bentham exposes the contradictions of the position that Hogarth adopted in his very Addisonian manifesto, The Analysis of Beauty, published 2 years later in 1753. In The Analysis of Beauty, Hogarth attempted a rational, impartial analysis of the truth of beauty to assist the ordinary observer and defeat what he saw as the artificial rules of art promoted by so-called connoisseurs. Now, in advocating an aesthetics of plain truth, Hogarth argues that the body of a living woman is more beautiful than the statue of Venus, and that the form of a woman's body surpasses that of a man. In Bentham's terms, however, a definition of beauty based on reproductive sexuality was not tenable, because, as we have learned, sexuality was an inclination without a fixed object that ignored the distinction between the beautiful and the ugly. So finally, the connection that Bentham makes of sexual irregularities between sexuality and taste also indicates why the need for the management of beauty arises within aesthetic realism, within what you might call bourgeois realism, bourgeois aesthetic realism. Once fixed rules of taste are abandoned in favor of the position of Addison's ordinary observer, that is, the person who decides that a living woman is more beautiful than a statue of Venus, it is hubristic to assume that this observer will be the ideal conduit for a socially normative definition of beauty and the general agreements on the agreeable that can provide the basis of a legislative science of taste. The potential for cultural barbarism that is inherent in the idea of the favored observer of a socially normative idea of beauty who belabors you with his club finds its opposition in Bentham's idea of sexuality as a sixth sense. We have to name what is actually barbaric, such as rewarding warriors with women, rather than concerning ourselves with a dubious bid for civilization by naming what is in bad taste. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. I'm just moving on to the next chapter in the book is by Benjamin Boursier, who picks up on something Emmanuelle mentioned about an early criticism of Bentham's view, that it might lead to an anarchy in taste, and how Bentham might deal with that through the role of the deontologist. The 10th chapter is entitled From Pain to Pleasure, Panopticon Dreams and Pentagon Petal, and this is by Fran Cottle and Marianne Muller. Fran is an artist as well as an academic at the Camberwell College of Arts. Marianne is a practicing architect, and she's also Professor of Architectural Design and Building Typology at the State Academy of Art and Design in Stuttgart. And their chapter is about an installation they made on the site of on the site of where Bentham hoped to build his Panopticon prison at Millbank. And so they discuss the role of or the nature of the Panopticon prison and the prison that was actually built there, the Millbank Penitentiary, and how they reconceived that through a bench which they placed on the site, and they explained their thinking behind the bench, and in a sense it was a way of giving people power to decide how they wanted to use space, in contrast to the space within a prison where you don't get much choice. And the final chapter is by Carolyn Shapiro from Falmouth University. Carolyn's background's in, there she is, hello Carolyn, is in critical theory, and appropriately enough she's written on the auto-icon, and I don't want to embarrass Carolyn too much by saying this, but I think this is really not only one of the best things I've read on the auto-icon, but just a super essay in itself. So, Carolyn, please tell us about your chapter.
I'm very humbled. Thank you so much. I actually prepared some slides. Is that okay, or shall I just talk? Is it okay to share some slides?
Yeah, Tim, are you?
Yeah, please do. If can.
Okay, that's great. Hopefully this will work.
If you click that, there's a share button on the toolbar.
Okay,
it's the one that looks like a screen with an arrow on it.
Okay, I think it's working. Well, first of all, while it's loading, I just want to thank Philip for his amazing compliments, and Malcolm and Anthony as well. So this has been a very exciting opportunity to write about the auto-icon. I've been working on this for a while, and I kind of came, and Philip said write about Bentham's image. And then I came up, as I was writing it, as I was reading this text in conjunction with the other texts, not Paul, but Jesus, and of sexual irregularities, I came up with this idea that it's all about the corpo reality check. What I really, my starting point here has to do with, was I wanted to look at Bentham's writing as a kind of the material writing scenario, because Bentham, of course, he was a philosopher, but he was also a writer, and he wrote, I would say, compulsively, for 60 years or so. So the manuscripts themselves have this physicality that you really get a sense of when you see the boxes. But when you read about when I was reading the editorial notes written by Philip and others, you just get a sense of the kind of the physicality and the trace of Bentham himself. And of course, Bentham, people think maybe, oh, it was a really odd thing that he auto-iconized himself and then he wrote a text about it. But in fact, what I'm trying to argue in the chapter is that there's a kind of consistency that is, it makes perfect sense that that Bentham auto-iconized himself, because he has this kind of consistent sort of infusion of his own body and of the notion of the body in writing itself. There's just this kind of conjunction between text and the body that you see through all his writings. And here, this is an example of kind of this insertion of a part of the body. This is the manacle that he put, his own hand that he puts into these notes. That's noted by the editors. But you also can just tell that there's this kind of invitation on Bentham's part that he wants editors to sort of make shape and put themselves into the shaping of his manuscripts to create a kind of final product. So the image, the auto-icon, of course, itself is, I understand it as a text in and of itself. So you've got the body of Jeremy Bentham. You also have this accompanying unpublished text, because it was so shocking to Bowring. He didn't want to publish it, called Auto-Icon or Farther Uses of the Dead to the Living, which he wrote about this kind of philosophy about what we should do to our bodies. And it's a great text to read. And of course, he was responding, I think he must have been responding to his good friend, Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith's article, Uses of the Dead to the Living, which is about the legalization of bodies for anatomical study. And I was really interested in Bentham's friendship with Southwood Smith, because he basically, not only did Southwood Smith help him to write this attachment to his will, which he describes how he wants himself made into this seated, clad skeleton. But he also left instructions in his will for Southwood Smith to dissect Bentham's body after Bentham died. So this is just a little section I found. This is a picture of the announcement of the lecture, which Southwood Smith delivered several days after Bentham died. And I think, I imagine it wasn't lost on some people here today that this is 188 years, almost to the day, that this lecture was performed by Southwood Smith in London to an audience, literally, dissecting his dear friend's body, which, is kind of amazing to me. So, so Southwood Smith was Bentham's friend, his amanuensis, his dissector. And these are sort of the things he says, what follows in a hand different from mine was drawn up some time ago at my desire by Dr. Southwood Smith. It's a witness. And here he gives the instructions to Southwood Smith for how to prepare his body. And then, of course, the performance of the dissection. And it struck me that Bentham is interested and happy to invite the hand of the dissector and also the hands of the editors, because I have always thought of his corpus and his corpse as this kind of, these parallel, integrated entities. And it does fit in with Bentham's philosophy on language, where he's always wanting language to go back to a real entity, a physical entity. So in this chapter, I'm really opening up the notion, his particular notion of that physical entity as a human body, and all of the body parts that Bentham sort of uses in his writing, throughout his writing. In the chapter, I kind of open up some, not only his kind of figures, his figures in the language that he uses that can be worked back to the body, but also, of course, that there's the consistency of his phraseopleresis and his paraphrases, which these kind of actions which he invented in a way, which always kind of keeps language from going too far into the realm of the abstract, too far away from the physics, from the physicality. And for him, this is key. This is really important. So these are just some examples of how he pretty much, I think, once you're aware, you think about Bentham's body, his interest in the body. When you read any kind of text of Bentham, you'll see that he always uses parts of the body in his language, whether it's sort of obvious or not. For example, he'll say something like the hand of misrule. He puts these manucles into his editorials. I'll talk a little bit about the example of the Grecianized ear in 1 minute. But anyway, keep that in mind the next time you read a text, that he often puts parts of the body into his writing. I think this is from Chrestomathia. He mentions that he has a Grecianized ear, and that some people, there's also such a thing as an un-Grecianized ear, which really I love, because Bentham really, and I thank Philip for pointing this out to me and helping me with this, but you can tell that Bentham really knows etymology, Greek and Latin. So he's very, very conscious of these kind of etymological foundations of words, which I read as a sort of parallel to the realness of a body which grounds language. So, for example, he uses, you might have noticed that in Not Paul But Jesus, he uses the word noxious and innoxious quite a lot. And that struck me, and I kind of thought about that. And when I looked it up, you could see that it comes from the Latin word noxa, harm, but it also goes back to the Greek root, which was nekros, for dead body. So I think that Bentham always has his Grecianized ear kind of tuned in. And I also think it's really, if we think about his use of calling him, a Grecianized ear, it is not the same as cognizant awareness and knowledge of etymology, so he's always taking it away from the metaphysics, away from the abstraction of knowledge, into this physical foundation of knowing. Not Paul But Jesus is a really, really interesting text to read, sort of conjoined with the Autoicon as a text. because I kind of read this as the construction of a kind of axis between the Paul side and the Jesus side. Paul being the ascetic sides with being, Jesus with pleasure and well-being. The Mosaic law, dispensation of justice, as we know, he's very much against that. And he puts that against something better, which is greater happiness principle, philosophic calculus, which is based on a kind of sympathy and cooperation, a body which doesn't separate itself in the way that the Paul type of body was. So he sets the body of Jesus up as a body which is open. And he uses the word intercourse frequently, but he means social and sexual intercourse. And Jesus is the intercourse, the body that is defined as an intercoursing body. And he talks about quite a few places the body's inlets. Whoops. Anyway, over moving here. Sorry about that. All right, well, I don't know what's happening. They're moving on their own. But what I wanted to also do is then to sort of set up not only the body of Jesus as this open body, this intercoursing body, but also the homosexual body. And he brings in his friend William Beckford, and he invites Beckford to be an editor and a sort of collaborator with him. And he admires him. And this is somewhat, I think this is again this kind of parallel between the editor as a kind of invited guest into the body of the writing, but also the body, the body in general. So you want to have, he's kind of promoting an open body, a body that he calls a sort of has an eccentric propensity. And then I was interested in that as well, because propensity is related to property and to the proper, which also goes back to the body, which also goes back to the autoicon. So I think this is really, really exciting, because I think we all know that Bentham was interested in bodies because of what he did at the end. But I think to think about the body of the corpus and the corpse and the sort of the body of writing and the kind of physicality of writing in this way, thinking about the consistency of the body as a kind of the substrate of all of his entire philosophy is exciting. And I think that these texts that we're looking at here have allowed us to do that. So I think
thanks. I think I've lost sound. Tim, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think Carolyn's pictures are still up on the screen. Oh, there we are. Thank you so much, Carolyn. It was Jimmy Burton's, the first general editor of the Bentham edition, who made the connection between corpse and corpus. But I think Carolyn's the first person to take that connection seriously, and so read all about it in the Bentham and the Arts volume. And we have time for some questions, but before we move on, I will say that there is a voucher available for a 20% discount on the book, which is available. There's the sales pitch in both paperback and hardback from UCL Press. Don't know if Chris or Tim. Oh, hello, Carolyn.
I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Clicked on something or other. I really apologize. Anyway, that will be it for now.
Thank you. So I was just saying that the book's available in hardback and softback from UCL Press, and there is a 20% off voucher, which I think one of my colleagues, either Chris or Tim, might put up a link to in the chat. It's also, of course, freely available for download. from the UCL Press website. But I want, before we move on to questions and comments, to thank a couple of people. First of all, Tim, not only for organising this seminar, but also for helping to organise the original series of seminars at which the papers were initially presented, as did a former colleague at the Bentham Project, Louise Seward. Also, big thanks to Chris Riley, who did a lot of work in putting the bibliographies into UCL Press House style, and did some fantastic work in getting permissions for various images which appear in the volume. So thank you, Chris. Should also thank the Faculty of Laws at UCL for giving us some funding, and the International Society for Utilitarian Studies, who topped it up, and also Malcolm, we thank the University of the Arts London, who also provided a grant which enabled Chris to do the work on the bibliography. And also just to say, we do have another Bentham seminar in 2 weeks' time. Sin Yen Ko from National University of Singapore and Yale will be speaking on Bentham on religion. That will be a standard seminar format. And 2 weeks after that, Scott Jack from Georgia State University on Amsterdam coffee houses, and there is a Bentham connection. But that's enough of the announcements and the advertisements. I want to say thank you so much to our speakers for really bringing the volume to life. It's been terrific to revisit those chapters. So are there any questions or comments, either from people from our contributors themselves, they're not excluded, or from our guests more generally? If you like to hover over your screen, and there's a raise your hand symbol which will indicate that you'd like to ask a question, and then I'll bring you in. You can turn on your mic and your camera, or else you can type a question into the chat box. I'm beginning to think I'm talking to myself.
No, we hear you.
Oh, hello. Who's?
I said we hear you. That's Carolyn.
Oh, right. Thanks, Carolyn. So there are no questions or comments. Well,
yeah, we've got Yasunori would like to ask a question.
Okay, sorry, yeah, I hadn't spotted that. Go ahead, Yasunori. Nice to have you with us.
Oh, well, can you hear?
We can hear you, yes.
Oh, yes, thank you. It's a nice opportunity to hear the various aspects of topics on dance and arts. Well, my question is very general. I think there was some category of the arts. Some are the arts of the aesthetics meaning in one side. The other is a kind of the way of life, as like of the homosexuality and so on. But the other issue is art of the some political meaning as a political persuasion, maybe. So there may be some kind of the connection between the logical presentation on one side, the other is some kind of the symbolic, persuasive, or some kind of the message way of the discussions. So, well, I'm not sure who is good to answer, but my question is the variety of the meaning of the arts in the context of your volumes. Thank you.
I'd be quite happy for Malcolm to have a go.
Right, okay. Right. Well, I think hopefully you can sense from the tenor of the presentations, beginning with Anthony's, which I think set the tone for the rest. What we're dealing with something really quite particular and historical. We're dealing with, for what you could call, broadly speaking, the bourgeois era and challenges to aristocracy. And there are many challenges to aristocracy in Enlightenment. Bentham's is one. I think what we've all noted is a radical difference in the way that Bentham challenges aristocracy and how that then changes his attitude to taste. Because just to take one example, someone like David Hume saw taste as an excellent way out of rules, because you could, through your own sensibility, make your own decisions and make your own choices and so forth and so on. Whereas I think Bentham, as we've learned, is quite anti-Hume and anti-Addison. So in one sense, there's a kind of a new realism about the arts that enters in the 18th century. But in some ways, at least I argue, that Bentham's realism is even more real. And therefore, it's really about this notion of challenge. It's not, as it were, although I did venture into a little bit of speculative art history, where I had this, idea that Bentham could read Hogarth. Bentham's not an art historian. He's someone who's concerned with utility, and that, as it were, has aesthetic implications. And just to finish, I think, generally speaking, you could say the Addisonian bourgeois person is trying to safeguard their own ethics within the world of goods and the dangerous world of public life. And Addison has one solution, Bentham has another. So I think the arts here has a historical meaning, but somebody else may have their own view.
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. So, anyone else would like to contribute or ask a question? No, that's all right. I mean, if not, I feel quite overwhelmed by what we've heard today. So I'm sure everyone who's listened has really enjoyed all those presentations, and it's given us a sense of the wealth of scholarship that's in the volume, and it's going to take us, I think, some time to, think through the implications of some of these papers for Bentham studies and beyond.
Philip, can I just take a moment to thank you?
Well, thank you
for guiding us all, because I said it in my talk, and it can't be said enough. What a major event the publication of the work on sexuality is. I'm a wee bit surprised it hasn't radicalized all kinds of fields of study, but maybe that's to come. But it's not often you get that classic combination of a body of scholarship that enables a whole new branch of research. But I think this book demonstrates how that works. So thank you from me, and I'm sure everyone else as well.
Yeah.
Thanks, Malcolm. I can just say a little bit about that volume. It actually goes back to Stephen Engelman, the American Bentham scholar, who was supposed to be hosting the International Society for Utilitarian Studies conference this summer, which of course has fell victim to the pandemic, though we'll hopefully be holding it next year. But he was preparing his Bentham Reader, which came out about 10 years ago under the title of Selected Writings, Jeremy Bentham, published by Yale University Press. And he'd picked up on Bentham's writings on sexuality from the extracts that were published many years ago in the 1930s by C.K. Ogden in Theory of Legislation. There are a few extracts at the back of that volume. And so I'm always very much against the publication of non-authentic Bentham. So I think I suggested to Stephen that we should look at the manuscripts and at least get an accurate transcript of the material. And working with Stephen on that project led to the initial publication of a version of Sextus in that volume that Stephen prepared, and that led on to the bid for funding, which was eventually successful with the Leverhulme Trust, who funded the writings on sexual morality. But it turned out that one of the significant writings, Not Paul but Jesus, was actually volume 3 of that work. Bentham published volume 1. It wasn't called volume 1, but it was just called Not Paul but Jesus. It was edited, we're pretty certain, by Francis Place, and was published under a pseudonym in 1823. But the second and third volumes exist in manuscript, and so we prepared the third volume as we would for a collected works volume, but decided that it needed to be published with the rest of Not Paul but Jesus, and so that's led to its being made available online, and it's not yet available in the collected works, unlike the other essays in the volume of sexual irregularities, the Sextus of sexual irregularities, and the general outline, the 3 essays that appear in the volume published in 2014. They were all written around 1816, and so form a group together. But there is also the earlier writings from 1780 on pederasty, the so-called essay on pederasty, which was intended for the penal code and which anticipates most of the themes. That was published in the Journal of Homosexuality by Crompton in the 1970s. But the one difference is that Bentham became a Democrat in between, and that makes that as an extra dimension to the 1810 writings of the 1810s, as does the appearance of Malthus, the Malthus's essay on population. So there is still more to come in terms of what appears in the collected works, in terms of the essay from the 1780s. Anyway, that's enough waffle from me, and so I just want to end by really thanking all our speakers today, and in fact all the contributors to the volume. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you, and I'm absolutely delighted by the result, and hopefully we can get some more publicity for this volume. People will read it, and it will make a real impact. It certainly deserves to do so. So anyway, thank you very much indeed. We've just reached 12 o'clock, and so it's our finishing time. But I hope some of you will join us in a couple of weeks' time for Zinchenko's seminar. So it's goodbye from me.
Thank you.
Bye, Philip. Cheers.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Very exciting.
Thanks so much, Philip. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Very enjoyable
Bye.
talk.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Anthony.